Hari, good morning. Thanks for taking some time to talk to me about yourself and your business this morning. Let's jump right into it. Can you give us a little bit of background about you, your career so far, and
Yeah,
how you kind of got into your consulting niche right now?
yeah, a little bit of a story actually. I was one of the early pioneers of what is today called natural language processing. When I was in engineering school, I grew up in India, around the world a little bit, but undergrad in India. I My first job, early job, was actually at a startup. I had this gentleman from Duke University at the time, who's now well known as Vivek Wadhwa was his name, and he hired me as a sort of his first full stack. Today it's called full stack engineer, but back then it was just software engineer to build what has now become natural language processing. And look, to be candid, it wasn't really feasible back in 2007, 2008, right? So I remember literally looking at the Oxford English Dictionary and the Webster's Dictionary, American Dictionary, and loading those words as C++ functions. It was not scalable. So 2 years into that job, I sort of gave up on software. I said, I don't want to do software. And so I came to business school here and decided, I want to work on tangible, actual improvements in people's lives. And so that's been my focus the next 15 years ever since, right? So I went to Kellogg for business school. As an international student, look, my management consulting was sort of my biggest option. And the company at that time was called Booz Allen Hamilton, hired me, and I insisted on being on the consumer product goods team. That was it. And the one company that allowed me to do that was Booz. And so I joined them. Thankfully, they liked me enough, but Booz Allen Hamilton split into a company called Booz and Company, which was fair enough. And then in the 6 years I was there, it got acquired by PricewaterhouseCoopers. And that made my journey into becoming a partner a bit more complicated. I'd worked now on consumer product goods and automotive now, but a lot of the work was focused on analytics growth for things like e-commerce and go-to-market strategy. I got hired away by Pepsi. So right when I was sort of up for that next level promotion, PepsiCo called me and said, "Hey, do you want to run global expansion for Quaker Oats?" And look, and to be very candid, I came in, of course, from an international country, and I'd grown companies in Asia at that time, and I'd seen that the globalization was not being done well enough. It's a very in America, even in back in 2016, American companies were not very global at all, and contrary to public perception. And I'd taken the contrarian view that look, you've got to actually. There's lots of companies that are, Pepsi included, but we're not really exploiting opportunities that were international. The center of gravity, as everyone says, was shifting to Asia, and Pepsi was pretty moderately penetrated in Asia and in Latin America and everywhere else. And so I led on the charge of improving Quaker Oats. Now, look, the tides shifted almost the opposite way, right? I think if you remember the last nine or 10 years, globalization sort of become a bad word. And Pepsi was the first sort of signal there because they decided to get rid of anything globalization and just relocalize their teams. And so I lost my job and got my next job at Avis Car Rental, back to my automotive background. Now, Avis was in a very interesting year. They just had a brutal year just before they hired me, but it was because a small startup at the time had launched in airports. And they'd taken 20% market share overnight. No one had taken them seriously until then, but now suddenly Uber was this big company that was killing the rental car industry. So my goal here, as sort of head of strategy, was to really turn around the company, really make it customer centric, and I did that for a couple of years. But no, look, I was at the center of the essentially the public eye when the pandemic hit, and Avis was one of the world's, if not most affected companies, just with the overnight hit of the pandemic. And again, not only did I look, but this time Avis had to just it was survival mode. And so right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was completely blindsided by what happened, as everyone was. Uh, I decided that the skill sets I'd gained from several years of work were that fundamentally new market entry and innovation was being done in a very sort of haphazard manner in big companies, but also I'd observed startups that were doing a lot better. And I started thinking of marrying the two. So I founded my own. I wanted to originally productize innovation. What ended up becoming was, of course, that in search for clients, it became a services company, and therefore now what I have is Mad Hatter Consulting, which helps early stage and sort of growth stage companies find product market fit in new markets, right? So I do a couple of things. Of course, my roots have been in international expansion, but that's very uncommon these days, originally. But, what I help with is new product entry, pricing very often. That's a background that I have significantly. And of course, the last few, maybe last few months or so have been a lot of AI implementations, including, and the industries I've tended to work on more these days now is, of course, automotive and mobility. Those are the most, that's the most, but very often, even in the volatile environments we've seen, I do a lot of work in consumer goods as well, where we see a lot of success, particularly in go-to-market. So yeah, we're go-to-market advisors for navigating disruption.
That's an incredible story. So I have a ton of questions, but I mean, can you kind of just tell us a little bit, like, what was the COVID crisis like? Like, what were some of the impacts of that?
Maybe let me take me back. So COVID happened in March, sort of middle of March 2020, and but 2 months before that, I want to say, let's say end of December, we had started seeing. I was, obviously in a global role at Avis, and I had started seeing some slowdown in China. And it's a franchise market. I'd even gone there, and there was some slowdown. There were a lot of shuttered shops, and my Chinese people were telling me, yeah, there's something serious happening and all that. But then also the voice in my head, and I've listened to some of the people, some advisors were like, look, Asia goes through this sort of shutdowns every 10 years or so. We had seen this in SARS. We'd seen this in that's what people are saying. So when I came back to the stateside, and I was like, well, what do you think our revenue estimates will be? I said, you know what, there's going to be some maybe 4 or 5 months of softness from China. It's not we're not heavily exposed. We may have to cut our European fleet by about 5-10%. And 5-10% was a huge amount, but they pushed back on me, said, oh, that's going to be nasty, that's going to be horrible. And I also said the US will probably be flat at best, right? They were not. But then broadly we decided, you know what, let's just give a 1 or 2% growth estimate overall. So, sort of the 5-10% loss in Europe was still considered too aggressive. Well, when the pandemic hit, about first week, I remember those days like they were yesterday, right? Because it was in slow motion recap. But first it came to Seattle. No one took it seriously. 2 days later, it hit Newark Airport. I want to say people started taking it seriously, and then it hit. Overnight, I basically saw, I was leading at that point, one of my P&Ls was international travelers, and that it suddenly just from European travelers had just gone down to like flat. And obviously what happened, one of the signals we saw was they were all asking for cancellations. Lots and lots and lots of people. Now, normally, look, if you ask for a couple of cancellations a day, you're going to get it, right? There's only a couple of cancellations the company's going to give it to you. So I basically told my team, you know what, if someone's canceling their trip, let's just go give it. Well, what happens if 90% of your trips are getting canceled and the cars are already booked? Well, my CEO called me into the room and he was like, why are you canceling why are you seeing so many cancellations? Well, that was our first signal that things were going really bad. And well, about a day or two later, we knew that we were in a very different situation. So we had a 95% revenue declines for the whole company because international travel had gotten banned. Well, it took up a little more because when the airlines got banned, people wanted to go after rental cars. So we got a little bit of that. But look, overall, we were 80% revenue declines. And that was not people. We had fought over 5 and 10% 2 months ago. We were now facing 80% decline. So within, I want to say, 2-3 weeks to a month, we were all gone. There was no. I actually spent the last 2 weeks at Avis cleaning cars and becoming the mechanic of sorts because a lot of our mechanics were not showing up to work. And we have forgotten how the early days actually worked, but there were no mask mandates back then. We didn't even know that masks were going to help. So I remember showing up to work in the last couple of weeks. I was a mechanic and I was servicing cars. I used to wear these, plastic bags on my hands and then try to wear something on my head just with, like a, like sort of ghost, right? So, and that's how I would touch the cars. It was horrible, but that's all I had. We didn't have masks. We didn't even know what was going to happen. There was a couple of people wearing masks, but that wasn't the case. We were all afraid. Every time you got a cold or people got frightened that minute. They were like, oh my God, I need to go. And so, so that's what happened during the pandemic, April 2020 onwards. And we knew that we were very, 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 very shocked, right? At that time, we were not set up to do remote work at all. Avis was typically we had our laptops fixed to our desks, and we were not allowed to take it. Very uncommon that we took it home. Now, I took it home, but many people did not take it home. And so we were really not set up for that infrastructurally. But obviously the company came out, I want to say within 6 months, reasonably well, and then became a meme stock 2 years later, because it's so much of the supply had been pent up. But yeah, it was a wild experience.
That's an incredible story. I appreciate you sharing that. Um, yeah, that's wild. Yeah, that's wild.
It's
And
wild. And
you're
look,
on
I
the
had
ground
some
floor.
PTSD after that because it was. It's scary when look, some of your employees or some of the people, staff around you are like, "Oh my God, I got a cold," and then you're gonna try and calm them down. You don't want to touch them because you don't want to die either. But what
Right,
do you do, right?
right. You go from head of strategy to cleaning cars too. It's
Yeah, it was. I went from head of strategy to guy cleaning cars, and look, to be honest, I think I did not like do it because I was had some crazy, times there. I had no background in cleaning. Not forget about cleaning a car. I was doing mechanic work. I was tinkering, and I had no idea how to do that. And that was a time when I was supposed to report into a person, was the shop supervisor, who reported into someone who reported into me. And I was like, what? And
that's
we didn't have standard operating procedures. They were all lost somewhere. Someone, password protected them. They were stuck in some locker, and then all it took was one person in that chain being off work for whatever, obviously for whatever reasons, and nothing worked. So yeah, we were in a pretty disastrous situation.
Was there any like big lessons you took away from that experience?
Yeah, look, I think the market has learned a little bit to not be too rigid with your supply chains, right? I think it was flexibility of supply chains mattered a lot. Now it's also got its own downsides to it, where they're expensive, having so much redundancy, But look, I think there's the biggest lesson I learned was on management, right? I think that the more of your field staff have context into what you're doing, and that's the hard part because the more layers there are, it becomes very difficult to communicate down and up to what's going on. But I think and one of the things I do with my clients is every time we're working with field, I think that senior leaders should spend time in the field doing the work very often, right? So if you're leading a team of fleet operators, you've got to drive the bus or drive the car every now and then. You got to maintain, you got to at least see and do something. Take the spanner and do whatever. Look, because that way you get to know what the real problems are. It's also dignity of labor, right? So everyone in the team is working towards the goal of making the company better. So I think those are the big lessons I took from the pandemic because I was a mechanic and I had no background in it. I had to learn from people. And I went in there and they were not, I was suddenly, my background and everything was not an asset, it was a negative, to be fair, right? I knew what was true. I knew how to read, but I didn't know how to do. And I had no background in, I'm an engineer by training and everything, but I didn't necessarily know how to, fix a starter relay, for example. I think one of the things I really struggled was, there was a starter relay in one of my cars that needed fixing. I had no clue.
Yeah. That's a great takeaway, though. I mean, I think that's like a great piece of advice, and a
Yeah,
great.
I think it's still true, right? And then consumer product companies, when I work with sometimes, the equivalent is store visits.
Mhm.
That far too often, food companies, they're making food, they're good at making food, they're good at making decks and marketing decks and so on. But very very uncommon that some of the even senior leaders will go to the shop, grocery store, see how their products are being shelved, that being stocked in the inventory, and how they're being shipped and so on, because that way you really improve your customer experience. And I learned that from the automotive industry, where I think it's a little more common because you see a car all the time. But yes, many leaders don't visit their dealers, um, and they don't necessarily visit the factory floor very often, at least, or if they visit it, it's a superficial visit. But I would say, honestly, to most leaders, pick up the spanner.
Yeah, love that. So tell us a little bit more about your company, your customers. You're working on go-to-market strategies. Like, tell us a little bit about like what that looks like for you. Who are your ideal customers, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So Mad Hatter Core is open for business. We help with the most complicated go-to-market challenges that companies have. So my company customers have fallen into sort of a couple of buckets. So they're all tech-enabled for the most part. So SaaS is a background that I have, of course, from vastly before in my background, but I tend to work on it in multiple companies. So they're all tech-enabled, tech-savvy. I have a background in engineering, so I know my world around both AI and ML and so on. But the industries or the sort of end goals of most of these companies are one of two, right? So one of them, or they are in transportation. They're either OEMs or basically fleet operators. So the MTA is one example, which I can publicly share. I've had companies like Polaris in the past. They're equipment manufacturers. They make jet skis. Um, they the other sort of industry I do play in a lot, I have a ton of background in, is consumer product goods. Help them with all things logistics, all things go to market, trade promotions management, and so on. And that's fun. Because at one point I was thinking of getting into the food industry innovative way, but it's slightly difficult. It's a different industry from sort of automotive. Fewer disruptions are still there, but they're not as heavy waves as what we're seeing in automotive.
Interesting. So how are you running, like, are you using any tools to like help you run your business more efficiently? I know we kind of talked a little bit about this, but tell us like,
Yeah. Oh, so when I start, I will probably have the opposite take of most people. When I started my business in 2020, I was partly PTSD, and I just said, you know what, I'm going to create a billion dollar company. And I said, I'm going to put in this tech stack. I'm going to automate, outreaches, go to market. I'm going to build this product for basically market research. And look, first of all, talking to customers, that wasn't really the demand was very volatile, so it wasn't easy to really figure out what. But then really, what happened was, at one point of time, about 2 years in, I had about 40 different. I had a tech stack of about 40 different vendors, each of them charging me in different ways. Okay, and I cut most of that, realizing that money was just going crazy. I cut most of that. And so what I really think that most people need to do before they go invest in too much tech is to figure out the first principles of what they're actually trying to achieve in their day-to-day. All right? So I am very tech light. I need tech, or in my own company, of course, I help companies with, of course, look, but you need to first fix your own processes within client. For example, if you're running a, planning process, well, have the salespeople and the supply chain people and the pricing people sit in the room and figure out, well, what are the things they disagree on, agree on? What does our planning look like, even on an Excel sheet first, okay? And then use technology to amplify that process at best, right? Can you do it 10,000? If you're doing it once well, 5 times well, manually, well, you can do it 5,000 times better. But then if you build that process discipline first, your technology works for you rather than the other way around, where you end up working for the technology. I see too many, and that was the mistake that I think I decided to fix. And I said, you know what? I'm going to cut all my technology. I'm going to literally cut it out, and I'm going to have my team work in person. There is a cultural benefit to it as well, which was very unusual so look, I was having a hard time right at the peak of the pandemic figuring out where my team even was, because they were all remote and I couldn't even figure out, very often I had to follow up with them 5 times to get any work done. When it became apparent, when I started doing this on the phone or going to people in person every week or so, a couple of us would meet up at a WeWorks. Work became a lot easier. It doesn't mean that you need to go back to in-person work, but on the phone, right? So when you call people, spontaneously, culturally, a lot of just benefits are unlocked. And that's, again, a sort of negative against technology. So if you have I had a bunch of communications, I had Zoom and Teams and everything, and Slack, and everyone's Slack and all that stuff. And to be very candid, I told people, just look, if it's an internal conversation to be had, call. That was one example, right? So then I stopped using automated, sales processes and everything, and my number conversion rates jumped. I stopped sort of, I've given some of the people who work with me now, I've gone to subcontractors, but they're allowed to use AI as long as they can defend their work fully. So which ensures that they're not using AI to create work entirely for them, right? They're allowed to use AI because I do think that it's an upskilling process and amplifies the work they do, but they're not allowed to use AI to present their entire work. So you can't just make a deck that's completely AI driven. I will see through it. So I really think the most important part is technology is a tool for amplification, not creation. It is even more true of AI. AI is a tool of amplification. So you could do your own work 10 times, but you have to do the first person's work.
I love that. That's such a good way to look at AI, because, you see people just throwing something into ChatGPT and saying,
Right.
Boom, that's the finished product, but that doesn't you're right, that doesn't fly, like especially if you're trying to present that to a customer or potential
Right,
client,
it
et
doesn't.
cetera.
And I learned this the hard way because early on, there were lots of people who told me, hey, look, you reach out to 1,000 people and then five will respond to you. And I had all that automated, right? I had a bunch of sales scripts and I had, and then I don't want to name companies or anything. And then I wanted to, then I got them into a calendar and then booked my calls every morning. And then very often those would be random calls. They just weren't, versus if I know who I'm talking to 24 hours in advance, I have time to prepare for that call. I have time to, make that call very custom. And I've only reached out to 20 people, five of which also responded, right? Because now I'm very clear with why I reached out to them in the first place. And I've read those emails.
Mhm.
That's how I do it.
Is there any, like, if you could take, like, whether it's AI or some tool that you use, is there anything that you are using that you've like fully vetted that now that it's a part of your process, it like fits? Is there any like one thing that you could vouch for?
I mean, look, the AI tools are still early enough. I use Gemini and Perplexity in my world for very specific surgical things. So if I have a complicated business case to make, I'll have it check my basic things. But I am still in control every single time. And to your question on, is there a tool technology that's fully vetted? Look, I do spend a little bit of time trying to vet technology. I don't think technology is going to ever or should replace a full person. So I don't. Let me think through this a little bit, right? Where is there a technology that I cannot live without? As an alternative way of phrasing your question.
Sure.
I don't think so. If you got rid of, with the exception of let's say emails and stuff, and if I lose my emails, I'll call people. Uh,
So you could live without it. Yeah.
Profound question. Can I live without email? I want to. To be very candid, I want to. I
Yeah.
mean, LinkedIn, for example, right? Of course, I use it for marketing and so on. It is important in a certain way. Don't get me wrong. It is important to have that presence online, but I use it for a purpose. I don't use it for the sake of using the technology. So
Like
tomorrow, because I learned this from the pandemic as well, right? You have certain dependencies, and if you get overly dependent, because what happens tomorrow, the technology changes the way it's pricing. You're
mhm.
screwed.
Yeah. That's a
So
great
it's
takeaway,
really
honestly.
because that's exactly what happened with, with so LinkedIn, for example. They charge you for everything now, right? We were all, like 2 years ago, I was very dependent on it because I was using it. It was free. Now, if you browse people, you got to pay them what the premium fees or whatever. But and look, and that would hurt, of course, a startup. And now, so I use technology for basically the classic sales of figuring out emails, LinkedIn for obviously, but very basic things, right? I use obviously developer technology for some of my product work. R, I use Python, but those are all things I know my team uses, and those are fine. But again, every time one of the product teams shows me something, I will ask them detailed questions about it. Oh, so I know fully well that they know, even if it's AI generated, if the code is AI generated, that is fine, but they need to have given the directions to it. They need to know exactly what AI is generating, and needs to be repeatable, right? So I'm not allowing my team to just use AI for the sake of it.
I like that. It's a different approach to like kind of like the mainstream, like use AI, don't worry about, so
Yeah,
I
and I think that's a bit of a look. The AI companies want you to use AI. Every technology wants you to use your technology. Look, at the end of the day, I've been on their side. Okay, I've been where technology, where like I'm using automation, robotic automation, for example. What technology takes away is that manager, if you may, whoever the person, the agent, or call it what you want, control over that process. And so if you literally walk away, having something being automated, you will stop knowing what it really is. And
mhm.
that's the problem, right? So yeah, that's exactly why you use it for amplification rather than creation. So if a engineer knows the details of what the technology is producing in automation, that's fine. And if you want to aim at zero defect manufacturing, for example, that's reasonable because a robot will do it with zero defects.
Mhm.
But you need to know the details of what the robot is doing for you.
Makes sense. What advice would you have for somebody who's looking to start their own consulting practice or coaching practice or anything like that? Like, do you have any
Yeah,
advice?
yeah. I think, I mean, there's various different types of consulting, right? So coaching as well as a type of consulting. If you may, I mean, if you want like career coaching or something, and then there's all sorts of financial planning coaching and so on. Uh, I think, and a lot of people are doing it. It's becoming one of the bigger. I want to say I was probably one of the early leaders of it, but it's becoming one of the sort of effects of the gig economy. I think fundamentally, take the time to figure out what your customers will pay for. It was one of my, to be honest, the first 2 years, I didn't have a problem selling because every third person I called had something to do right then. And the third year, things went bad for me, right? It was like, oh my God, because I'm trying to push beyond my own comfort level. And if I'd done that work early on, I would have been, I wouldn't have had a third terrible year. But so I think really spend the time on figuring out two parts of it, which is what does your sort of stakeholder set want? So who is that stakeholder set? What challenges are they facing with that you can solve quickly? One of the challenges I think I still face is getting in front of enough people. So something like what you're doing in the podcast and getting people to listen to it is a great initiative, and I do that, right? So I think one of the challenges is getting in front of enough people, but you need to have done 30 to 50 of those conversations, figuring out what that pain point is, and that's the hard part, figuring out exactly what that pain point is before you want to offer them what you could do for some money, right? Because I think there's enough literature on this that you need to figure out where there's money, and if you can find about somewhere between 50 to 100 people who will pay you, then I think, to be honest, you're in business.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. So, Hari, where do you want to be 6-12 months from now? Like, what are your goals, aspirations?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, look, on one end, I'm it's a good question because I like what I'm doing at Mad Hatter. It's doing I've done some cool things that I think would not have been possible in a normal corporate job. But I also see the serious innovation going on in automotive, especially in the autonomous vehicle revolution. And so I'm actually talking to some of the big players to see if I could help them with commercialization, because I've done commercialization my whole life, particularly with disruptive sort of technology. So I'm going to try and focus a lot more on the autonomous vehicle fleet management and the sort of disruptions in that space. Within 6 and 12 months. I hope it's 6 and 12. I think it's, because these things, the field is very nascent, but I'm trying to focus more on sharpen the pencil more on that one specific problem to solve rather than trying to do broadly disruption. So yeah, I'm trying to become a lot more sharp.
Nice. I like that. If you could wave like a wand and say like, hey, I'm going to solve this one problem either for yourself or for your business, like what would that be?
Look, I would love to solve, the process of getting the early product discovery. By the way, I had a product and then when I realized that, maybe technology, you need to mix it with process, and it became a consulting company. If you could always wake up in the morning, or if you could always have 24 hours from now, 5 vetted conversations with the 5 right people every single day, that would be great. Because I still do spend a lot of time on just the wrong qualified conversations. And nothing wrong with them, but they've grown up and very often they're not a fit, right? That happens more often than not. But if I always had 5 good conversations every single day with very good quality fit, that saves my top of the funnel. One of the ways I'm doing that right now with my own podcast, I do a lot of writing, so the people who tend to read those are already a little bit qualified. But that would be something I'd like to solve for the company.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I mean, I would like that too, and so would probably most people. So. Amazing. If anybody's interested in hearing more about you or Mad Hatter or your podcast, like how can they find you? Like what's the best way to reach out?
You can look me up on LinkedIn. I believe I'm the only Hari Sripathi around, or just you could email me. I'm hari.sripathi at hiremadhatter.com. I will say that the word Mad Hatter is polarizing. People either love it or hate it. But I've considered, between the question of what problem would I like to solve, I'm a bit torn because I like the Mad Hatter because it talks to wearing different hats and solving complicated problems. But there are some people who want me to be more plain and staid. So it's fair.
I was going to say I love the name Mad Hatter. So
yeah, that's the thing. So there's always I feel like a qualifying first bar is do they approve of the name? There's some who don't.
Interesting. Tell me, why do people not like the name? I gotta ask that.
Well, I want to say it falls into 2 buckets, right? If you're open to being a little zany, that's when you're like hire Mad Hatter, because it's consulting, right? The more traditionalist consultants are like, you're supposed to be in a tie and a suit. Why would you call yourself a mad person?
Yeah.
And I used to use and early in the day, I've stopped it now, but I used to deliberately be a bit provocative with my decks and so on. They would have some, they would be friendly. The intention was to be friendly, but they would have like Comic Sans font. Yeah, some of my more traditional consultant friends had a panic attack on that. They were like, "Oh, that's not." Look, let's be fair to them, right? Those guys are not exactly. They're not. The industry is known as too staid and boring. I was trying to shake things up a little bit, so fair enough. If anyone's watching from the traditional consulting industry, that's why I'm coming after you.
Yeah.
I'm making it more fun. I think I made it more fun. But yeah, that's why I'm the Mad Hatter still. And now there's people who will greet me as the Mad Hatter.
Well, Mad Hatter, I love the name. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Anything else you want to share before we hop off here?
No, Eamon, thank you for having me. I think you're doing something wonderful yourself. Thank you for helping, small boutique consultants, obviously with more visibility.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you.